Heads of state of almost every African country are in Washington, D.C. this week for the 2014 Africa Summit. For the White House, it's an opportunity to build new business relationships. After all, 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies are on the African continent. And for world superpowers like China and the U.S., that means that tens of billions of investment dollars are at stake. Obama is also seizing on the moment to polish up his presidential legacy when it comes to Africa. But it couldn't come at a worse time, as the summit's already being marred by the news of the recent Ebola outbreak, issues of human rights, and growing insecurity by way of international terrorism. So to discuss the backlash against the summit, I was joined earlier by Kambale Musavuli, national spokesperson for Friends of the Congo, who had just taken part in a demonstration. I first asked Kambale why he was protesting the event.
Good governance and human rights are issues on the continent. One, as a young African, it's the first thing to see that actually there's a spotlight on Africa. But the problem I have with it is those who they've invited to Washington. Most of the leaders who have been invited have records of human rights abuse and good governance. Most of them, I would say a few of them, are trying to change the constitution in the countries to run forever. In the case of Uganda, the president of Uganda has been in power since 1986. Burkina Faso, over 2 decades so far. Congo-Brazzaville is also changing the constitution. In the case of the Congo, the current president is also changing the constitution. So I can name all these different countries. So a week before the summit, Obama convened young Africans in Washington in his so-called Young African Leadership Initiative. A week later, he's bringing the Africa Strongman. So he's sending mixed messages to African youth, saying, on one hand, we want you to have good leadership. On the other hand, I will invite the African dictators to dine with me. So that's a very confusing message for young Africans who may look at it as a positive thing for the United States to do. But for me, it's really U.S. interest. The U.S. trying to counter China on the African continent. China had an Africa summit in the early 2000s. So it's a way to have Africa for sale, as many have said. What can we get out of Africa instead of supporting the will of the people on the continent?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk specifically about some of these leaders that he was dining with, African leaders, Equatorial Guinea, Rwanda, Uganda. I mean, all of these people have been involved in horrific human rights violations. Exactly. Considering how bad leaders have been used as actual pretext to invade entire countries, were you surprised at kind of the willingness to sit down with these people?
I was shocked. Simply because of what Obama did in 2009. Now, Obama went to Ghana and he had a speech where he spoke about good governance. He spoke about the need of strong institutions and not strong men. But it's very confusing that the same man who went on the African continent, who said those beautiful words, that now is inviting those strong men to Washington to discuss how we can get access to Africa's resources, how to have bilateral aid or trade with Africa. That is not something that I would have expected. And that will stay as Obama's legacy to the continent. The invasion of labor, the support of strong men on the continent, and at the detriment of the will of the African people.
Right, it's kind of saying one thing and doing another. Exactly. As you just mentioned, this quote, we don't need strong men, we need strong institutions. Yes. Was there anything in the summit that actually pointed toward building up institutions?
Actually, no. I would point out now, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, met with President Kabila. A few months ago, in May, he was in Congo, and he spoke about the need for democracy in Congo and the need for the Congolese government not to change the constitution. Just this week, on Monday, he had a press conference with the president of the Congo where he was congratulating him for the advance he has done in democracy. And I sent a tweet to him. I asked him, what has President Kabila done to advance democracy in Congo? We have yet seen that. So that confusion is very clear. But what I'm clear as a young African is the solution will not be in Washington. It's disheartening to see African leaders flocking into Washington to think that Washington will solve African issues. I would want to see one day that African leaders are going on the continent to discuss with Africans on the continent about the needs rather than them coming to Washington to try to figure out what they can get out of U.S. taxpayers' money.
Yeah, well said. And I think a lot of this funding with also the emboldening of with military aid is given to the worst human rights offenders across Africa. And, you know, Captain Rick Cook, chief of the U.S. Africa Command Center, recently told a room full of military contractors, hey, the U.S. has been at war with Africa for the last 18 months. How does the military-industrial complex play into the U.S. desire to kind of get more involved in the continent?
Seeing even with what's happening with Boko Haram, the American drones flying over Nigeria, even over the Congo, this has been a plan that's been actually written way early in the 2000s by the Heritage Foundation, discussing the need of having a U.S. military presence on the continent. Africa needs many things, but the last thing they need is American soldiers to come in an umbrella of providing peace and security. Africa does not need that. What we need is actually fair partners. But unfortunately, because the leaders of African countries do not represent the people, we're seeing little by little African leaders allowing U.S. military there. George Bush could not get it done, by the way. When George Bush was president, he tried to travel to Africa to have African leaders accept the African command. 14 nations publicly came out saying no. But now this is the context. We have the so-called son of Africa in Barack Obama, and people are forgetting that he's still the president of one of the most powerful imperial power in the world, and they're allowing him to bring American soldiers there. You know, when you look at Camp Le Mans in Djibouti, in Uganda, for example, the attack of Libya was being launched from Entebbe airport. In the Congo, they call it military post. But when you speak to the locals, you see that the so-called military post is growing into a military base, and it's growing and growing. But I'm clear, is to counter China's presence there. China has been a collaborator with the Africans in bringing development and infrastructure development on the continent. There may be discussion about what is China is actually doing, but one thing as a young African I know, China is not supporting strong men where they're bringing their weapons and the military to train these dictators who are killing African people. So that's the difference between those two dynamics.
This is an incredible point. And I was just going to ask you, how did this happen? How did we get to this point where there's more than one military operation happening across the entire continent, with the exception of just 2 countries, according to AFRICOM's own numbers?
Yes.
I'm shocked. I mean, really, when I hear people saying, I mean, we've been at war with Africa, that we're conducting military operations so widespread, how did we get here? Is it just the transition going into Obama? I mean, it seems like this has been in place for a long, long time behind the scenes. Yes.
And there's been Africa policy, U.S. Africa policy has been access to resources. And what the U.S. know how to do, if I should say even what they know how to do well, is military, you know, causing desolation around the world. It's very unfortunate to always see the military as an engine for economic prosperity for the United States. That needs to be challenged, but the question is not just America. Our American taxpayers, American citizens that I meet on a daily basis know what they are doing on the African continent. Will they be okay to know that the drones, the military equipment that is being provided to Africa is killing children under the age of 5? Like in the case of the Congo, they say half of the deaths in Congo have been children under the age of 5. We're talking about over 3 million young people under the age of 5 who have died. So the question is not the American government. Will the American citizen actually exercise their civic duty to hold the government accountable for the operations on the African continent?
Well, I certainly didn't know, and I think if a lot of people did, they wouldn't agree with it at all. But what is your response to people who say that Obama needs to work with these leaders to bring economic development and who kind of can't see outside of that military buildup?
You know, Africa is not poor. I think people usually forget it. The reason why the U.S. is engaging with Africa because they know the potential of the African continent. Africa is the last place they need for the resources. Africa is endowed by so many strategic minerals. So when we're speaking even about trade, I don't see the relationship of the United States and Norway being the same way as the United States and Congo, for example. Because whenever they're dealing with their European counterparts, that's not how they're dealing with. I'm not seeing the United States training French soldiers, Norwegians or any other European nations. Why are they doing so on the African continent? No, Africa as a continent is not there to be recolonized. But in this context also, the people in these countries, we are not waiting for Washington to change. People in all these countries are organizing. In Burkina Faso, we had a movement of youth who are taking it to the street. Even in Sudan, in Khartoum, there is a youth group called Gerifna mobilizing the youth to have a say in the democratic process. In the Congo, the same thing. So the youth of Africa They are mobilizing. The challenge that they face, that the people who represent them are being backed by Washington, and they have an arsenal of weapons that they are using to oppress the population.
So it's actually suppressing that grassroots growth and the support for the people on the ground who really need to be heard the most.
Yes.
Kambale, and your organization focuses on the ongoing genocide in the Congo. Look, this is another issue that's just completely off the radar. If you ask someone on the street what's going on with the genocide in Congo, they'd say, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, talk about what's going on in the streets and why there's almost been a complete media silence on this issue.
This is actually a score to the human conscience. I mean, nowhere in the world this could happen. 6 million human beings who have died since 1996 to present. They continue to suffer. On one hand, you have in the east 2 of the staunchest U.S. allies, Rwanda and Uganda, who have invaded the Congo twice with documentation of their invasions, yet no accountability. Can you imagine that right now we have on the Security Council at the United Nations, Rwanda, where while the United Nations is publishing reports showing how Rwanda is supporting rebel groups in the Congo. And you know what happened this week? The president of Rwanda and the first lady of Rwanda, they were right in Washington, dining with President Barack Obama. That's a complete contradiction at the expense of the millions who have died. The issue is not just even in Congo, because while we have lost many lives right in Congo, also in Rwanda, the Rwandans cannot even have a voice. They have killed activists who are challenging the government, even genocide survivors who have challenged the government, or even Rwandans who live abroad have been assassinated with documentation, and there is no accountability for that. And what I call, many have actually dubbed it, is that Rwanda is becoming the Israel of Africa. No matter what they do on the African continent, they do not hold them accountable for the crimes that they perpetrate on the African continent.
Incredible. We have about 30 seconds left, but what can we do? Because I feel so helpless hearing this. And of course, our establishment is just emboldening these leaders that are criminal and engaging in horrendous human rights abuses and suppressing the people that we need to be hearing the most. Kambale, what can we do to help?
Few things. One, holding the U.S. government accountable, not just by statement. We have a law, Public Law 109456, which was written by Barack Obama as a senator. This law calls for sanctions for any nation, corporations destabilizing the Congo.
What a coincidence.
Yeah, so he wrote the law, he's now the president, so we have to remind him, hey, this is what you actually did. So the engagement will actually help. I'm not saying it just as an activist action. We've done this before. The American people stood against the apartheid regime when they mobilized people in this country to hold U.S. president, and the time also Reagan, toward the end of his presidency. We saw action. That's what we need today. The Congo movement of today is as important as the South Africa movement was yesterday.
And it's all connected. Thank you so much for breaking it down. Incredible. Kambale Musavuli, spokesperson of the Friends of the Congo. Really appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much. 14 Africa Summit. For the White House, it's an opportunity to build new business relationships. After all, 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies are on the African continent. And for world superpowers like China and the U.S., that means that the heads of state of almost every African country are in Washington, D.C. this week for the 2000 issues of human rights and growing insecurity by way of international terrorism. So to discuss the backlash against the summit, I was joined earlier by Kambale Musavuli, national spokesperson for Friends of the Congo, who had just taken part in a demonstration. I first asked Kambale why he was protesting the event.
Good governance and human rights issues on the continent. One, as a young African, it's the first thing to see that actually there's a spotlight on Africa. But the problem I have with it is those
tens of billions of investment dollars are at stake. Obama's also seizing on the moment to polish up his presidential legacy when it comes to Africa. But it couldn't come at a worse time, as the summit's already being marred by the news of the recent Ebola outbreak.